Welcome to the MS Dev Show, episode number 193.
This is an episode in our special series recorded live from the Podcast Central at Build. We bring you the best guests for some of the best announcements. Raygun gives you complete visibility on errors, crashes, and performance problems affecting your end users. Replicate issues in seconds rather than digging through log files or having to rely on users to report errors or crashes. Raygun gives you a window into how users are really experiencing your software applications. Check it out today at raygun.com.
We are now talking to Yina, Areanas Principal Program Manager on the Microsoft Graph team. How's it going?
Hello, guys. How's it going?
I know it's day 3, and I know everybody's kind of losing steam.
I know it's one of those moments where you're in a downhill.
Yeah. But you had a really cool part in the keynote, so it was an awesome demo. So great job on that.
Yes.
Yep. We're going to be talking about Microsoft Graph here. So I think where we should start, because there are still some people who haven't used the Microsoft Graph, or they've looked at it in the past and they haven't looked at it recently. So let's just kind of start a quick recap on what the Microsoft Graph is and what the capabilities are.
Absolutely. So Microsoft Graph is a unified REST API endpoint for developers to use to access to all of the data that customers have on Microsoft Cloud services, whether that is Office 365, Windows, or enterprise mobility and security. So it's a REST endpoint. You have obviously to authenticate because, it's users' data. We have the highest standards for control and management of users' data. So users grant access for applications to interact with that data. And then as a developer, you can build cool applications that take advantage of all of the capabilities that are on the Microsoft 365 platform.
Very cool. Awesome. So you talked to us last about a year ago. What's been new in this past year?
Yeah. Oh man, a lot of things new. It's we ship constantly new things on the Microsoft Graph. Let me try to highlight a few. One, of course, is the activities APIs coming new to the Microsoft Graph. We announced them last year at Build for supporting consumer accounts. Mm-hmm. And this year, last year they were in preview. This year, we're taking them to general availability, supporting both consumer accounts and organizational accounts. Okay. So if you're an enterprise developer that is building now a Windows app or is building iOS or mobile application, Android, and you want to get activities in the timeline, then you can make a simple request to the graph and get all of your activities in there. That's one that is pretty cool.
So I'm assuming you can get them and you can push them into there?
Of course, yes. Okay, you can get them and you can update them. Yep. And another one that we added recently is the security API. So Microsoft has a lot of security offerings, and partners can also participate in this ecosystem. So we have new APIs that allow you to get access to all of the alerts, security alerts across your organization. So you can start making insights about what is happening around security prompts and security alerts on the organization. That's another one that has landed recently. Teams is one that we added by Ignite. We have the capability for creating teams, for getting access to channel messages, to creating channels, the full lifecycle interaction for the Teams APIs. I mean, there's a ton of things that are coming into the graph. We're constantly adding more things. Another service that we just added for Build is the Bookings APIs. Mm-hmm. So Bookings is a service that we have as part of the Office 365 offering that is targeted to small and medium businesses that are managing all of their booking appointments. So imagine that I am a beauty parlor or a dentist office, and then you're managing the bookings that they have with all of the different customers. So we have new APIs that allow you to interact with their service. Those are some of the new things that are coming in. I mean, it's so many services adding data to the graph that is just amazing. It's just mind-blowing to see.
Well, I'm sure it shifts from in the beginning, it was probably hey, you kind of start from nothing and then you sort of have to pull in these different services. And I assume now, the services that are missing, they're probably they feel left out now.
Yeah.
They sort of stand out if they're not part of the graph.
You know what? I have been working on the graph since the graph was an idea.
Yeah.
And it started with SharePoint, Azure Active Directory, and Exchange. And how did we, as we were transitioning from on-premises services to the cloud, how we bring forward the ecosystem of developers that were already developing on-prem solutions. So we started doing all of these different things around standardizing on REST APIs because the different services had different patterns. Some of them had SOAP-based APIs, other ones only had PowerShell commandlets. And so we started working on building REST APIs. What does it mean for doing API design? So we started working on patterns for doing API design. Consent and authorization models, permission models, and all of those things. And we did it for these 3 services, 3.5, 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And then it's just like you're saying, at the beginning, it was very grassroots effort. And we were kind of knocking doors on different teams to say hey, come participate of this thing. It's going to be eventually a huge thing. The graph, from the beginning, we didn't name it just the Office graph. It was I wanted it to be the Microsoft graph. And, with that vision that I was going to have multiple services. And it really transformed to what you were saying, from us kind of knocking doors to the different teams to now the teams, everyone wanted to be part of it, right? And it's huge value proposition for the developers, because one of the things that we've done is not just putting everything on one single endpoint, but really thinking about the designs of the APIs. So if you come in as a developer and you learn how to interact with one data set, for example, users and groups, then you can translate all of that knowledge to, I already know how to work with files. I already know how to work with messages. I already know how to work with security alerts, because the patterns that we use for the API design are consistent across, right? So all of that knowledge basically translates, and the amount of time that you have to spend, learning those concepts just it trunks.
I think we really take it for granted, because I remember before that, let's just be frank, it was a mess. You go to service A and it's we'll return XML. You go to service B, here's how you authenticate, and we return this other weird thing. And so I remember some of those early discussions actually. I actually was on some of those email threads where they're talking about just unifying those things. And it's just awesome seeing this thing grow up and turn into what it is. So.
Indeed. It's just for a developer, it was a little bit of a brain surgery to interact with our services, right? It's and it used to be that we had very specialized developer ecosystems. So we had the Exchange developers and the SharePoint developers and the developers that interact just with Windows, and they don't merge with interact with each other. But it's no longer the case, right? With our cloud-based services, our data is all over. The experiences are merging across many different things. So, for example, if you're interacting with a group has membership in the directory. It has files in SharePoint. It has conversations in Teams, right? It's all of these different experiences that are across many different services. And you as a developer should not have to worry about where that data is stored, or, having to figure out different authentication models to interact with the data. So that's a lot of the work that we've been doing with the graph. It's just getting together all of these different teams across Microsoft to bring new patterns and practices around API design, standardize on how do we do authentication and authorization, and get all of these data in a way that developers can easily consume.
Yep. So speaking of data, so I think one of the cool things that you demoed, which I guess we talked about this before the show, it's actually been available for some time. And I remember years and years and years ago, I've always wanted to do this, and there was never a great way of doing it. But in the demo that you gave, it was basically you had an Excel spreadsheet, and Carl was mentioning, Excel runs the world, clearly.
Yes.
It actually runs a lot of different business processes, and even companies will use it for pricing calculations or whatever, right? Yeah. And now you want to have, let's say, a website, and it has to use that pricing calculation. And I know specifically Carl and I have actually been given one of those spreadsheets, and you have to, and it's just hey, turn this into code. And I've actually even looked for libraries to can I use some of those formulas, and it never turns out well. And I always wanted to be I just want to push some values into Excel, let it do its magic into that exact spreadsheet.
Read the values back.
And then read it back. Yeah. And that was the demo you did. I'm oh. So can you kind of walk us through that?
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
So cool.
So like you're saying, Excel is such a powerful tool, and it just powers so many organizations around the world. We wouldn't think about, it is a very sophisticated tool, but you would think that organizations around the world will build their own super sophisticated things. A lot of people are just using Excel out of the box and then using some customizations on top of it. And so the scenario for the demo that I did in the keynote was you have the finance team that is working on the budget models. And of course, they breathe and live every single day on Excel, right? And then we have an entirely different team on the company that needs to send them updated information and needs to have all of the latest values that they have on the budget. So instead of having, like you were saying, to reproduce all of that logic in code separately, you can use the Microsoft Graph to read and write and interact with the entire Excel object model. So all of the things that need to happen is that file needs to be stored in SharePoint and OneDrive. Of course, it needs to be in the cloud. It needs to be addressable for the graph to be able to access it. And then we have an entire API set that allows developers to interact with the worksheet, the entire workbook, the worksheet, the ranges, tables, charts, all of the functions. All of that capability, you can, just to the level of like setting values and formats and all of those things on an Excel cell. And you can do that remotely and read that information remotely. Just like you were saying, it's like very simple way to interact without having to rebuild all of that logic on your own application.
Yeah, I remember a decade ago, some people listening, I think, will probably relate to this. It was like a decade ago, maybe even more than that, when you had to do it through like the desktop version of Excel. And I don't know if you ever had to do that.
Interop,
and it was basically impossible to close Excel. It was always terrible. I remember I
bet that there are still people that have machines running with Excel just to have the .exe running all the time, so that you can you use the PIA, DLL to do the calculations and so forth. Yeah.
So finally, they have a path forward.
They have a path forward. Yes, absolutely. They have a path forward.
That's great.
So you were also talking to us earlier about a new way to distribute JavaScript user-defined functions. Can you, explain what those are and what makes you so excited about this distribution method?
Absolutely. So, to give you a little bit of context, I'm going to take you back several years where Office development was basically you build a BBA macro that travels with the document. And if you're in a large organization, you put that macro in a file. One, there's some security concerns about that. And then two, if there was a bug, you had 100, 200 copies of that file all over in your organization. And you had to recall all of those copies and then ask them to make the fixes. You didn't know which file had the fix versus not, and all of this. It was an entire mess to manage the life cycle of those applications, or those BBA applications or COM-based applications. Now, we have been investing in a new model for extensibility in Office. It's a web-based model that all you have to do, all the document knows is of an XML file, is a manifest that points to your service. And then your service has all of the logic, and that basically Excel can invoke that functionality when it runs, right? So what we have enabled now, it has been in preview for about 6 months, is that now you can write custom functions. They're written in JavaScript, and they will basically implement your own function, your own logic, and then you can invoke them and you can save them in a namespace and a custom namespace. So like what I was showing yesterday in the keynote, it's a user-defined. Well, it's not quite a user. A developer will code it, the definition.
I never even thought about that. That was really poorly named.
Yeah, UDF is user-defined function. So we're still like, well, it's not quite an UDF.
Yeah.
It's
like a DDF.
It's not a DDF, JavaScript DDF. We're still figuring out.
Definitely work at Microsoft.
Well, naming is such a hard thing, right?
I know.
So what you can do now is you can write your JavaScript code. You can also call your internal web services or web services available, publicly, and then package that and deploy it to your organization. So it's central. You can, through a functionality that we have in Office 365 that is called centralized deployment, you can make it available to a user. So for example, you just want Carl to be able to access this functionality, or you can make it available to groups in the organization. We just want to make it available to the finance team or to the data scientist team or whatever, or you can make it available to the entire organization. And because the code is centralized, you don't have the problems that you had before of having to chase down all of the different copies of the file that had the code and then fixing that. And the other cool thing that we have with this is that we've built a connection to Azure ML. So as a data scientist, you could build your own models in Azure ML and point the functions to those models. So in Excel, you can start, within the Excel application, you can point to an Azure ML model that is running on the cloud, and then bring that data back into Excel.
Yeah, so it's like operationalized through Excel.
Yep,
that's really
exactly.
Cool.
I mean, it's like back to that's where people spend their time on, they're familiar with. So not taking them out of that context and bringing that powerful functionality to it.
Is that the only way that you can distribute JDD, whatever they were before? No, these defined functions. Was that the only way to distribute them then? Is centrally, or can you still do it the old way where it travels with the spreadsheet?
You can do it in a way that, so basically what it points is to a web service, right? So you can do it in a way where you site load them on your own, and then you can do it also on an organizational level basis. Like as a developer, you will sideload that in, right? Like you could try it and all things like that.
Yeah, I was thinking of like ISV solutions where the software company, like they have to create a function and then they have to ship it to another enterprise.
We also have the store. Right, so we also have a global
so you can distribute
store.
The store.
Right, yes.
Oh, okay. Well, done deal.
We also have a global store where developers can submit their add-ins. We call them web add-ins, and they're available then as any other. Users can go into the built-in store front UI that we have in the clients, like in Excel and Word and PowerPoint, and they can find this functionality.
Raygun provides full-stack error, crash, and performance monitoring for tech teams. Whether you're a software engineer looking to diagnose and resolve issues with greater speed and accuracy, a product manager drowning in bug reports, or you're just concerned you're losing customers to poor quality online experiences, Raygun can provide you with the answers. Get full stack error and performance monitoring in one place. The next time you're struggling to replicate errors and performance issues in your codebase, think Raygun. Head over to raygun.com. Get up and running within minutes and dramatically improve the online experiences of your users.
So how is security handled in Microsoft Graph? Because I know like a lot of enterprises, when you start talking about like data like leaving their infrastructure, that gets a little bit nerve-wracking, especially for the IT administrators.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So Microsoft Graph has, like as I was saying before, all of this data across all of these different services, and each of the data sets has their own has a permission model, and we have a set of permission scopes that developers will need to choose. So, for example, if you want to interact with user profile information, so that there is a user scope, right? Like, and then you will have to decide what level of access you will want. Do you want to just only read access, or read-write access? Do you want at the user's level or at the organizational level? And depending on that, on those toggles, then there are going to be different ways into which users will consent to it. So, for example, if I get an application that wants to get access to my calendar because it's helping me, manage my calendar throughout the day, I can consent to that because it's my calendar. Right? So I can grant that application access. But if that same application wanted to then call to get your calendar, right? Like then that will not be able to access it because you have not consented to the application and I don't have access to your calendar. So there is always that authorization that happens to make sure that the application and the user have permission to the data that is being granted. Now, at the large organizational level, right? Like, for example, let's say we have an application that is running scanning on the mailboxes to make sure that users in the organization are not sending social security numbers or things like that, right? Like that's an organizational wide thing, that there's no, the user context in there it's an administrator who will be consenting to this application to be able to access all of this data at the organizational level and be doing these jobs, right? So there's the different levels of granularity on the access control, depending on the data set that the developer wants to access and depending on the ownership of that data set.
Okay. And then what if it isn't an organizational user? What if it's whatever we call a live ID these days, like a Microsoft ID, like a consumer account?
Yes, absolutely. So as well, if you are building an application for, say, John Doe at Outlook.com that has Outlook services or OneDrive services, you can absolutely do that with the Microsoft Graph and with the same authentication flows that we use for the organizational accounts. We actually have combined endpoints for consumer and commercial for both authentication and authorization and for the API. So if, say, for example, I was building an application that allows me to manage my work and my personal calendar, right? Like, because you sometimes have things that need to come together.
Yeah.
So this application can read my personal calendar, can read my work calendar, and allow me to like manage my time. So that application can do that, read both, get access to both calendars with the same code. Like, I don't have to write like different code bases, or I don't have to like manage that in a different way. So I just, it's basically the same APIs across
That's a
both
relief.
services. Yes, I know. Yeah.
You had mentioned earlier that there's team support Microsoft Graph. Like, what does that mean? That there's Teams is integrated with that.
Yeah. So Microsoft Teams is, I think we've already gotten to the 1 year of Microsoft Teams.
I think so.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it has been
amazing, huh?
widely adopted. It's amazing the number of organizations that are adopting Microsoft Teams across many, many different countries. And Microsoft Teams foundationally are built on top of groups in Office 365. So every group you can then convert into a team. And so we have the APIs to do that. So imagine that you have previously had, hundreds of groups in your organization, and now you want to add the Teams capability so you can do that, automate all of that process using the Microsoft Graph. So that's one of the functionalities that we have in Teams, in the Teams APIs. Then we also have, the same capability that we have in groups to adding memberships and managing the group membership applies to Teams because they are groups. And then we have the APIs to creating channel messages, to creating channels, to managing that life cycle of Teams. And now we're adding new things around being able to control the entire life cycle. One of the things that we see a lot across organizations is that they are spinning off teams for a particular project, and then they want to archive it, and then they want to, just decommission that group, and then automate the process of creating groups and having that workflow kind of end to end be taken care of by users. And there's for example, if you have settings on the team, or if you have applications that you have already added to that team, like all of that configuration, not having to do that manually, and just like being able to run that in an automated way. All of those are things that you can do with the Microsoft Graph.
So I'm kind of curious, like Teams being as young as it is, like it's younger than the Graph. So when they started, did they have their own API, or were they smart and they came to you right in the beginning?
We have for Teams actually for different services, we're all over the place.
Yeah.
Graph in itself is a federation gateway. So the data continues to be stored across many different services, and the Graph knows where the data is and goes and retrieves that data from those different data stores. Teams, some of the initial underlying infrastructure was having their own endpoint. And then slowly have been migrating and adding all of that functionality to the Graph. And now with the convergence between Teams and Skype for Business, there is also additional work that we're doing to bring in more and more functionality. Yeah.
And then Open API, which apparently I just heard this is like the new name for Swagger.
Yes.
So what about Open API support?
So we are adding Open API support to Microsoft Graph. This is a thing that people have been asking us since we started working on the Graph. It's like, Swagger is such a popular description format across the industry. Like everyone that is doing working with REST APIs is working with Swagger as well. And the key point of that is the number of the community tools that are available, right? Like the interoperability between these tools. Swagger is no longer, because of SmartBear, open sourced actually the description language, and then it was renamed OpenAPI. The V3, version 3 of OpenAPI was released back in November, and was the first time that we were able to actually describe the graph nature of the API.
Okay, that's cool. So you were waiting for some functionality.
Exactly. We had some limitations on the V2 version that prevented us from like doing all of these resources and the relationships that are there. So we've now worked with the OpenAPI team and added some of those capabilities. Microsoft Graph is basically based on OData, so we've built an OData to OpenAPI translation engine, and now we have the first version of the OpenAPI v3 descriptions for the Microsoft Graph. It's not complete. And even if we have the resources and the level 1 relationships. And even with that, there are places where we're breaking some tools because just the vast amount of number of resources that are available in the graph.
So we're stress testing open API.
Yes. Yeah, we're stress testing the tools that are based on the definitions. And so we're working on how do we slice and dice things here and there so that people can really take advantage of all of that ecosystem of tooling that is available with OpenAPI. Yeah.
Cool.
Now, you had mentioned that Graph is mostly a set of REST APIs, but is there also a set of SDKs in various languages if I don't want to have to make those REST calls myself?
Absolutely. So if you are comfortable making REST APIs, then you're welcome to make all of the REST APIs, but I know that there's a ton of developers out there that prefer libraries. So we have libraries in many, many different languages, starting with .NET. We have .NET libraries. They support .NET Core. We have Java. We have library Java that we released not too long ago. We have JavaScript with typing definitions. So if you're into TypeScript, then you can also write applications that interact with the graph. We have Python, and we have PHP. We have Android, iOS, Ruby. I mean, there's a ton of languages that we support in terms of libraries.
That's awesome.
Yes. So if there's a flavor that you don't see there and then you like to see it, let us know because, we've been making a lot of investment on having libraries available on all of these different languages for developers to use.
That's great. And then what about graph support for Power Apps?
Oh, that's another one that we have been working on. So, we have been working with the Power Apps, the Logic Apps, and the Flow team, the entire family, to connect the Power Apps ecosystem and empower citizen developers basically to be able to connect to the Microsoft Graph. So we have created a set of connectors that use the Microsoft Graph to different functionalities, so profile information, directory information.
Oh, so this is Power Apps integrating with the graph then, so actually accessing the graph.
Yes, exactly. So every time
that makes a ton of sense.
Power Apps interacts with that data, is doing it through Microsoft Graph.
Yeah.
And then we've also built a set of templates. So we have a meeting apps template, a booking rooms template, a sending kudos template. There's 12 templates that we've built that basically just have the app there, and then you can customize it, but it has already all of the functionality, connects with the graph. My favorite is the one for meetings, because it as a information worker, you can use that application out of the box in Power Apps, and allows you to capture the meeting notes, and then allows you to capture the tasks, and then after the meeting is done, it uses the graph to send an email with a summary over Outlook. It uses the Planner APIs in Microsoft Graph to put all of the tasks, and it uses OneNote to put all of the notes for the meeting. So that's a really cool integration of Power Apps on Microsoft Graph.
You are the glue.
Yes, the glue.
That should just be your title, the glue.
Queen of the Graph is also one that.
Oh, that's good too. That's good.
So if someone wanted to get started with graph development, how easy is it for them to get started?
Super easy. Super easy. The only thing that you need to remember is graph.microsoft.com. You put that in the URL, and then it'll take you to the developer site that we have. Mm-hmm. We have tools to get you up and running and making a request to Microsoft Graph in less than 3 seconds, which is the Graph Explorer. Even if you don't want to put in your account, there is a demo account in there that you can start playing and making requests to the API, seeing what type of data sets you can get back. If you have 3 minutes, then we have the quick starts, which in your preferred language, we have different set of projects, whether it is ASP.NET, Node.js, Angular, PHP, and things like that. More than that, then you can go to the quick starts, and in less than 3 minutes, you're going to have an app registered, and you're going to be able to download the code and just run it. And then we have all of the API reference, all of the documentation, once you are ready to go, once you're hooked in, then we have all of the docs that you will be able to use to really get into your development.
Very cool. Now, I know you went over a ton of stuff, but is there anything that we left out that you wanted to talk about?
Wow, we really talked about it.
You told us about 5 years worth of stuff in the past year. so maybe we
I'll
covered
mention
it.
another one, which is a thing that I also made a call out in the keynote yesterday, which is the UWP controls. So we are investing a lot on how do we make it even easier, right? Like making a REST request is super easier, right? But how do we make it even easier for developers to interact with data that is in the graph? So we created this UWP controls. We have controls for profile, for people picking, for files and tasks. And then if you are developing a UWP app with just bringing one control into your app, then you have integration with information in the graph, right?
That's
like,
cool.
So many scenarios require for users to have a profile or a contact card, or for selecting users within the organization, or for bringing content from SharePoint. So all of those, like that's another one. And how to get to that is the Windows Community Toolkit.
Okay.
So aka.ms/Windows Toolkit is where we will be redirected to the GitHub repo.
And we'll have all those in the show notes. Perfect.
Yeah.
So where can people find you on Twitter?
My Twitter handle is at Yina, which is my first name, YINA, _ Arenas, which is ARENAS.
Okay, perfect. And where can people find you, Carl?
You can find me on Twitter at Carl Schweitzer.
You can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/ytechie. So, Yina, thank you so much for coming on here and talking about this. This is amazing how much work you've done in the past year. Queen of the graph.
Yes. Yes, it's a lot. If it's not just me, of course, there's a lot, an entire team, super smart people working on this, having lots of fun, bringing all of Microsoft together. This is truly a showcase of a one Microsoft project. All of us bringing together, making it easier for developers to interact with Microsoft data.